When I first laid eyes on the property, it didn't look like much. A modest cabin nestled among thick pines with the roof slightly sagging and a wraparound porch that had seen better days. But beyond the weathered boards and chipping paint was something more valuable to me than any luxury home in a gated community solitude. I had spent 22 years in the Army Corps of Engineers. I'd built roads through jungles, repaired dams in remote corners of the world, and stared down more than a few men in uniform who didn't like taking orders from someone who looked like me. I wasn't interested in combat anymore, not with people, not with policies, and certainly not with power-hungry bureaucrats. I just wanted peace. The land had been in my family for generations. My grandfather bought it in 1948, back when no one wanted to live near the creek because of the rattlesnakes and mudslides. Over the years, my father turned the cabin into a hunting lodge, and when he passed, it came to me. 32 acres stretching from the wooded hillside all the way down to the lake. What I didn't know at the time, what would soon become the centerpiece of a very different kind of war, was that this land also included the natural creek that fed into the lake, serving as the HOA's primary water source. I didn't move in right away. For a few years after retirement, I traveled. Vietnam, Montana, southern Spain. But no matter where I went, that land kept calling to me. Something in the air. Something about the slow gurgle of the water moving over rocks, the way the morning mist hugged the treetops. So last fall I returned. Not just to visit, I came to stay. The cabin needed work, plumbing, electricity, the works, but I'd done more with less before. I spent the first few weeks clearing debris, patching up shingles, and replacing the septic tank. I drove into town every few days for supplies, and that's where I started hearing about the HOA. Make sure your mailbox is the right color, the hardware store owner joked. They'll fine you if it ain't. Another guy at the diner warned me not to paint my porch anything other than taupe beige or approved gray. I thought he was joking until he slid me a printed pamphlet, HOA Covenant Rules and Regulations. It was thick. But I'm not part of the HOA, I said. He shrugged. Doesn't mean they won't try. I didn't pay it much mind. My land sat just outside the formal boundary of their development, an older parcel that had never been brought under the HOA charter. I was a neighbor, not a member. And more importantly, I had the original deed. A handwritten copy from the county clerk's office, complete with the stamped survey lines marking the creek and outlining the full reach of the property, including the lakeside strip. The first real encounter came a few weeks later. I had driven my backhoe down to the edge of the creek. It was a beautiful Saturday morning, and I'd planned to start excavating the overgrown channel to restore the original flow pattern. Years of debris had shifted the water away from the natural bend, leading to erosion near the roots of several trees. I marked off a safe area with caution tape, reviewed the county environmental guidelines, and got to work. That's when I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. Two men stepped out of a white SUV marked HOA Safety Patrol. They wore navy blue shirts with matching hats, badges stitched onto the fabric, not metal. One carried a clipboard, the other a walkie-talkie. "You can't do that here," clipboard said. I turned off the machine, climbed down, and removed my gloves. "Do what?" "Excavate. This is protected HOA land." "No," I said calmly. "This is my land. I've got the deed if you'd like to see it." They exchanged a look. Walkie-talkie stepped forward. "This creek is part of the watershed that supplies common areas. You're disturbing flow patterns that impact the whole neighborhood." I nodded. "I'm restoring the natural path. County approves it. It's private property. You're going to need to cease activity immediately." Clipboard said, pen poised. I chuckled. "You can write whatever you like, son. But unless you're from the county, you have no authority here." His jaw clenched. "We represent the HOA. That includes environmental enforcement." "No," I said again. "It doesn't. You're not law enforcement, and I'm not part of your HOA." That was the moment I saw it, the flicker in their eyes. The realization that I wouldn't be easy to intimidate. They weren't used to resistance, not from someone who knew where they stood. They left without saying another word. But I had the sense this wasn't over. A few days later, I received a letter. It wasn't from the county. It was from the HOA Enforcement Committee, citing me for unauthorized water disturbance, visual disruption of shared natural resources, and refusal to comply with community environmental standards. The letter was filled with vague legalese and hollow threats. But the part that struck me was the closing line. Failure to comply may result in escalation to legal enforcement under Subdivision Statute 8.52a. They were bluffing. That statute only applied to properties within HOA governance, and I knew for a fact mine wasn't. But I also knew what they were trying to do: bury me in paperwork letters and perceived authority until I gave up. They didn't realize who they were dealing with. I had spent most of my life navigating real bureaucracies, real command structures, and actual chains of authority. I'd built floodgates in war zones. These weren't officers. They were bullies with clipboards, and they had just made a very costly mistake. Because that insignificant little creek they were so concerned about, it ran straight through my land, and it fed the lake they relied on for every drop of water. When I moved in, I made it a point to be neighborly. I wasn't looking to stir up trouble, I just wanted to restore the land, breathe a little deeper, and maybe even share a few cups of coffee with the locals. My first few weeks in the area were surprisingly pleasant. A retired couple named Howard and Louise brought over a pie. A few kids from the nearby development waved when I passed. And the postman Marvin even warned me which roads to avoid during rainstorms. It reminded me of small towns I'd been stationed near tight-knit communities, where everyone knew everyone's dog's name. There was an unspoken rhythm to it, like a song you'd forgotten you remembered. But there was also a tension beneath the surface one I didn't recognize until I touched the wrong string. That string offense. I wasn't putting up a fortress, just a simple post and wire perimeter around the creek bed, maybe 2 feet high, more decorative than defensive. My goal was to protect the native grasses and young saplings I planted near the water's edge. Erosion had eaten away large swaths of the bank over the years, and I wanted to reclaim the land before it gave way entirely. I'd cleared the area myself, removing trash, pulling out invasive plants, even relocating a family of turtles that had nested too close to the future work zone. I had the approval from the county's conservation office printed and posted right on a wooden stake. Still 3 days into the project, a woman in yoga pants and oversized sunglasses showed up, arms crossed tight against her chest. "That's not allowed," she said before even introducing herself. I looked up from the shovel. "Good morning to you too. You're building a fence. That violates section—" "I'm not in your HOA," I interrupted. "You must be mistaken." She blinked, her lips parting slightly. "I'm the chair of the HOA Landscaping Committee." I held out my hand. "Congratulations." She didn't shake it. Instead, she looked over my shoulder, surveying the posts I'd sunk into the earth, the ones wrapped in bright orange caution ribbon. "This is visible from the walking trail. The trail on my property." Her cheeks flushed. "We've used that trail for over a decade." I nodded slowly. "Without permission, I assume. It's part of the neighborhood's experience." "Not anymore." She pulled out her phone. "I'll be reporting this." I shrugged. "To whom?" "The HOA." "That's cute," I said. "Do you want a copy of my deed while you're at it?" She stared at me, like I'd just spoken in ancient Greek. It was the first time I saw the real fear, not of me, but of someone she couldn't control. And when you build your whole identity on control, losing it feels like collapse. She turned on her heel and left without another word. The next day, I found my work site vandalized. Someone had pulled up 2 of the fence posts, snapped the ribbons, and scattered fresh soil across the rock-stabilized slope. It wasn't kids, these were deliberate strikes, calculated and personal. The saplings I'd planted were trampled, and one of the turtle nesting signs I'd made was cracked clean in half. I didn't call the police. I didn't yell. I just got to work earlier the next morning, repaired everything, and installed 2 trail cameras facing the creek. Later that week, I saw the HOA newsletter. I wasn't supposed to receive it again. Not a member, but someone had slipped it into my mailbox. The headline article: "Unauthorized land modifications near community trail." The article didn't name me, but it was laced with vague accusations about someone disturbing natural aesthetics and erecting visual obstructions on shared land. It even included a grainy photo of my fence line, likely taken from a smartphone. I smiled. Let them posture. Let them print their fear on glossy paper. Because they were missing the point. That creek, it wasn't near community land. It wasn't community land at all. It was mine. But they didn't stop there. The following Monday, I got a knock on the door. This time it wasn't safety patrol, at least not officially. It was a man in his 50s, tall, lean, wearing khakis, and a tight blue polo shirt with a stitched emblem, Brookshire Waterside HOA Compliance Officer. His name tag read Mr. W. Haynes. "I'm here on behalf of the HOA to discuss your ongoing project," he said stiffly. "Which one?" I asked, holding the door but not stepping aside. The creek modifications. You mean my restoration efforts? We've had multiple reports of ecological disruption. From people who don't live on my land. He flinched slightly but continued. You've altered the landscape in a way that impacts our neighborhood's water flow. I folded my arms. You realize that your neighborhood gets its water from the lake, which is fed directly by this creek, right? That's exactly why we're concerned. You should be grateful, I replied. I've improved filtration and stabilized runoff. Nonetheless, he said, taking out a folded letter, we must inform you that failure to cease operations will result in HOA-level sanctions and possible referral to the County Water Board. I took the letter, glanced at the header, and let out a long breath through my nose. Mr. Haynes, I said, my voice even. I spent 22 years building water systems across 3 continents. I know what I'm doing. I also know that your HOA doesn't have jurisdiction here. You're out of your lane. You may find, he said quietly, that the HOA's influence reaches further than you think. And with that, he turned and walked away. I stood on my porch for a long time holding that empty letter full of empty threats. They weren't trying to protect the community. They were trying to protect their illusion of power. That night, I walked down to the edge of the creek. The moon hung low, casting silver ripples across the water. I stood there for a long while, listening. The creek didn't care about rules. It didn't ask for permission. It carved its own way through stone and time. And now so would I. The next morning, I didn't waste time. The sun hadn't yet broken through the canopy, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. I'd spent the previous night reviewing every environmental permit. I'd acquired every county zoning ordinance, every land boundary marker. My files were meticulous, compiled from years of navigating international regulations and municipal codes. I'd seen enough bureaucracy in my life to know when someone tries to intimidate you with paper, you come back with a mountain of it. By 7 a.m., I had my county-approved documents posted at the edge of the worksite, laminated and zip-tied to a rebar pole. I backed my excavator into position, a modest, mid-sized Komatsu I'd rented from a friend, and fired it up. The goal was simple: remove decades of silt buildup, recenter the creek's flow, and create a stabilized berm to protect the eastern bank from collapse. I wasn't altering the path drastically, just guiding it back to what it had been when my grandfather first mapped it in the 1950s. I moved the first scoop of earth with care. It wasn't just excavation, it was restoration. I removed broken concrete chunks that had been dumped illegally decades ago. I pried out rusted rebar that had no business near a water source. With every load of debris I set aside, I could feel the land breathing again. And then, not 45 minutes in, I heard them. Tires on gravel. 2 white SUVs pulled up side by side, blocking the entrance to my work zone like a roadblock. I turned in my seat, engine idling, and watched as 4 people stepped out. They wore matching dark blue shirts with embroidered patches. Brookshire Waterside HOA Enforcement Division. Badges, radios, clipboards, and in the hand of the oldest looking among them, a camcorder. My blood pressure didn't rise. I didn't climb down. I simply stared at them, waiting. The man with the camcorder, tall, graying, sharp jawline, walked closer and raised his voice. Sir, you are being recorded under Article 14.2 of the HOA Environmental Oversight Code. Please stop your machinery. I leaned out of the cab. Article 14.2 only applies to member properties. I'm not in your HOA. A younger guy with a nervous mustache flipped through a stack of papers. This creek, he said, feeds into the HOA reservoir. That makes it part of the shared watershed, and thus under HOA jurisdiction. No, it makes it hydrologically connected, I replied. It doesn't override land ownership. Camcorder man stepped forward. We've had complaints. Your activity is endangering protected aquatic life and could affect water clarity downstream. I raised my brow. Funny. The only thing I've seen in this water are beer cans and rusted lawn chairs. That your idea of protected species? He didn't laugh. Instead, the woman with the clipboard stepped up. This is your final warning. If you continue excavation, we will escalate this to HOA legal enforcement and file an injunction with the city. I shut off the engine and climbed down slowly, boots landing heavy in the wet grass. You've sent 2 letters, I said. You've trespassed on private land. You've attempted to intimidate me using authority you don't legally hold, so I'll make this easy. I walked over to the laminated sign and tapped it. This is my county permit. It allows for excavation of this section of the creek under the Watershed Restoration and Erosion Control Act, signed and approved. I reached into a waterproof binder and held up the plat map. This is my deed. This creek from the old stone culvert up to the bend near the maple trees is within my property line. Your development starts beyond that ridge. I took a breath and met their eyes. And this, I said, holding up a folded sheet, is a registered survey conducted 3 years ago, confirming that I not only own this land, but also the entire lake you pull your HOA water from. Their faces paled in unison. That's when camcorder man lowered his camera slightly and asked, quieter now, "Wait, the whole lake?" I nodded. "Bought it off the county during the drought 10 years ago. My name is on the easement rights, too." There was a long, awkward pause. "You're bluffing," Mustache said. I unfolded the easement document and handed it to him. He stared at the signature line, then at me, then back again. Camcorder man whispered something to clipboard lady. Then they turned around and left. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't take their camera. They just got back into their SUVs, slammed the doors, and drove off in a cloud of dust. That night, I got a visit from Howard, the neighbor, who'd brought me a pie my first week. He stood awkwardly at the bottom of the porch steps, twisting his cap in his hands. I just wanted to say, he mumbled, "I didn't know they were going to send all that." I nodded. "Wasn't your fault. They said you were damming the water. I was unblocking it." He sighed. "People around here don't like change." "I didn't change anything," I said gently. "I just reminded the land what it used to be." He looked at me for a long moment and then smiled. "You know, your dad said the same thing once." Then he left. But the next day, I noticed something new. The walking trail signs that had been planted along my side of the creek were gone, ripped out. No apology, no explanation, just gone. 3 days passed without incident, and I started to believe, foolishly, that maybe the HOA had finally understood their place. The sun was high, the weather dry, and the creek had begun to take shape. Its flow no longer splintered and strangled by old junk or sediment buildup. It had a rhythm again, a clean pulse, and I could see minnows darting through the shadows for the first time in years. But peace, like clear water, rarely stays undisturbed when bullies with clipboards are involved. I was back at the far end of the creek when I saw them, 2 silhouettes standing near the edge of my property line, right where the woods gave way to the slope that led down toward the lake. They weren't trying to hide. One had a broad, boxy frame and stood with an arm on his hip, like he was posing for a brochure. The other, thin and wiry, scribbled furiously on a clipboard. I turned off the engine of my excavator, climbed down, and walked toward them, slowly making sure to wipe my gloves on my jeans as I went. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice steady. The big man smiled. "Just observing." The woman with the clipboard didn't look up. "He's actively excavating," she said aloud, like I wasn't standing there. "On my land," I replied with county approval. She flipped a page. "This is impacting downstream sediment flow. We've already taken readings." I narrowed my eyes. "You've been taking water samples." "Standard HOA procedure," the big man chimed in, when environmental disruption is suspected. I stepped closer. "Let me guess you didn't inform the county before taking those readings." Neither of them answered. That's what I thought. Then the clipboard came up, this time toward me. "You are in violation of subsection 7B, which prohibits unauthorized modifications to water-bearing land connected to shared HOA infrastructure." I snorted. "You made that up." She blinked. "Excuse me? There is no subsection 7B. I've read your entire covenant twice. It only applies to lots within your jurisdiction, and I am explicitly exempt." Her hand trembled just slightly, but she stood firm. "The HOA has broader powers than you understand." "No," I said, "you have exactly the powers granted to you by your charter, which ends 200 feet that way at the first row of mailboxes. You don't get to expand your kingdom because you feel nervous about losing control." Big guy took a step forward. "Look, this doesn't need to get hostile." I raised my hand. "I'm not being hostile, I'm being precise." That shut him up. But then the woman reached into her folder and produced something new, a printed letter with an official-looking stamp at the top. "We are escalating this," she said. "You'll receive a cease and desist from our legal team within the week. We're filing with the city planning office to restrict your excavation until further notice." I took the paper. The stamp was a bluff, just a watermark logo, not an official seal. The name of their legal team was a paralegal service 3 towns over. But what irked me more than anything was the signature at the bottom. Chairwoman Bethany R. Ward. Of course, yoga pants. I looked at the 2 of them. "This is your plan. Drown me in nonsense until I give up." Big guy opened his mouth, but I cut him off. "You think because you've got radios and clipboards and matching shirts, you're some kind of authority. But all you are is loud." I stepped forward until there was less than a foot between us. You don't scare me. You don't intimidate me. And you certainly don't own me." The woman folded her folder closed and nodded to Big Guy. They both walked off without another word, and I didn't stop watching them until they were out of sight. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and laid the cease and desist letter beside my grandfather's original plat map. My land hadn't changed. The creek hadn't changed. What had changed was the people, the way entitlement seeped into communities like mold, slow and unnoticed until it chokes the foundation. I knew they weren't finished. The next day, I got a call. It was from a county inspector, a man named Daniel Russo, friendly voice, thick Boston accent. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I got a report here about unlicensed land alteration. Your address ring a bell?" I sighed. "Yes, I'm sure it does." "I'm not accusing," he added quickly, "but I gotta check it out. County orders." "Come on by," I said. "Bring a chair. I'll have coffee." He showed up that afternoon. Young guy, maybe early 30s, notebook under one arm and a tired look in his eyes. I gave him the grand tour, the permits, the maps, the conservation office approvals, and even the turtle relocation forms. By the end of it, he was nodding. "You know," he said, flipping through my binder, "this is cleaner than most municipal sites I inspect. Appreciate that. I'll file my report," he added. "You'll be clear, but off the record." "Sure." "You ticked off someone with a lot of influence." I raised an eyebrow. "The HOA." He chuckled. "Bethany Ward sits on the county beautification board. She's well connected." Real pushy. "Of course she was. She called 3 times this week," Russo said. "Same complaint, word for word. Like she was reading from a script." I exhaled. "Thanks for the heads up." He shook my hand, climbed into his truck, and drove off down the hill. I watched the dust settle, then looked down at the creek now flowing clear and steady. It was never about the fence, never about the fish or the trail or the grass. It was about power. And the moment they realized they couldn't control me, they panicked. That night, I stayed up late organizing my files, photographing every inch of progress, and printing out every document with fresh signatures. Because the next battle wasn't going to be fought in the dirt. It would be fought on paper, and I was ready. The wind was sharp that morning, whipping through the valley like it had somewhere to be. I stood at the edge of the creek, coffee in hand, watching the water flow strong and purposeful again. The restoration was nearly complete. Where once the bank had collapsed and weeds had choked the waterway, now smooth stones guided the current. Grasses were beginning to sprout. A blue heron had even returned something my father used to say was a sign of balance. But I knew better than to mistake balance for peace. The HOA had gone quiet, too quiet. No letters, no patrols, no visits. That kind of silence was never benign. It was the silence of planning, of quiet meetings behind closed doors, of whispers traveling through the thin walls of influence. Sure enough, 3 days later I was served. A man in a cheap blazer knocked on my door just after lunch, holding a thick manila envelope in both hands. "Mr. Carter, that's me. You've been served," he said flatly, and handed me the envelope before walking off without another word. Inside was exactly what I expected, a civil complaint filed by the Brookshire Waterside HOA. They were petitioning the county to place an emergency injunction on my excavation and unauthorized land use. The filing cited environmental disruption interference with shared infrastructure, and my personal favorite, degradation of visual harmony within the community. They wanted to drag me into court, and not just any court. They'd filed through a subdivision-friendly municipal judge known for siding with HOAs in previous land disputes. The hearing was scheduled in 2 weeks, just enough time for them to prep their attack and hope I'd buckle. But they had made a critical mistake. They underestimated how prepared I already was. I spent the next 48 hours assembling everything. I pulled out the full land deed, yellowed with age, but pristine in clarity, signed by the county clerk in 1972. It included detailed boundary descriptions, down to the natural markers from the split-trunk elm at the northeastern ridge to the bend in Deerwater Creek, thence south to the lake inlet. I made high-resolution scans and digital backups of everything. The deed, the easement rights, the 2013 water survey that showed the creek and lake lying fully within my property. I printed copies of the environmental permits I'd obtained from the county. I even secured a notarized affidavit from the conservation officer who'd visited my site 6 months ago and praised the restoration plans. But the centerpiece was a document very few knew existed, an old water easement agreement from the 1980s, signed between the Carter family and the county, granting my father, and now me, full ownership and maintenance control of the natural water system on the property, including the spring source and the lake basin. It also included a clause that required written permission for any party, including HOAs, to access, divert, or manipulate the flow. In other words, not only did I own the land, but I also controlled their water. Literally. And I had never signed anything to change that. They must have known, or maybe not. Maybe they'd relied so long on assumption and bluff that they truly believed the creek and the lake were theirs by proximity alone. That weekend, I called an old friend, Michael Danner, a retired attorney who'd once specialized in land disputes. We'd served together during our time overseas, where his pen often proved sharper than any blade. He reviewed the documents, whistled low, and said simply, "They're screwed." Still, he helped me prep the case, binding the documents, highlighting key legal language, annotating county codes in the margins. We drafted a counter-motion not just to dismiss the injunction, but to seek damages for harassment and trespassing. On the day of the hearing, I wore a clean button-down pressed slacks and boots, polished enough to pass for respectable, but worn enough to show I worked the land I owned. When I walked into the courthouse, they were already there. Bethany Ward sat at the front of their side of the courtroom, her arms folded, lips pursed into a line of self-righteous fury. Beside her sat two HOA board members, a paralegal, and a man who introduced himself as special counsel for the Brookshire Waterside Preservation Group, a fancy way of saying HOA's hired legal muscle. The judge, an older man with heavy glasses and a disapproving frown, looked over the file, then motioned for them to begin. Their lawyer stood up, cleared his throat, and launched into a dramatic monologue about community cohesion, environmental threats, and the sanctity of shared spaces. He painted me as a rogue actor, an aggressive landowner whose selfish actions had endangered the delicate ecological fabric of their neighborhood. I didn't interrupt. I let them spin their story, let the room fill with their version of the truth. Then the judge turned to me. "Mr. Carter." I stood slowly, cleared my throat, and walked to the table. "I'd like to submit a full rebuttal," I said, handing him the bound dossier, including original land, deeds, permit records, county surveys, and a certified easement agreement dating back to 1982. The judge adjusted his glasses, thumbing through the thick pages, then paused. "You're saying the HOA's complaint is invalid because the land in question is entirely under your ownership?" "Yes, sir." "And the water?" "My family has held control of the creek spring source and lake for over 40 years. The HOA draws from it, but they do not own it. Nor do they hold usage rights without my consent." Bethany jumped to her feet. "That's absurd." The judge raised a hand. "Mrs. Ward, please sit." She did, but not quietly. Their lawyer asked for a continuance. The judge refused. He flipped through this easement clause and sighed. "This is very thorough, Mr. Carter, and I see no legal basis to uphold the HOA's complaint." I exhaled slowly. "Furthermore," the judge added, "if I may speak plainly, this seems like a case of jurisdictional overreach." He turned to Bethany. "You cannot enforce HOA codes on non-members. You do not own the creek. You do not own the lake. And if this man has documentation proving your use of the water depends on his permission, then you're on very thin ice." The gavel came down. "Injunction denied." I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply nodded, gathered my binder, and walked out. Bethany glared at me the entire way, and for the first time, I saw something different in her eyes. Not anger, not righteousness, but fear, because now she knew. She'd pushed too far, and I hadn't just won this round. I now held all the cards. A week after the court ruling, the silence returned, but this time it was different. It wasn't the same calculating quiet I'd felt before. This silence was strained, uneasy. I could feel it in the way cars slowed down when they passed my driveway, in the way the neighborhood kids no longer played near the property line. The HOA didn't issue another letter. No one knocked on my door. But the shift was palpable. I spent the first few days back focusing on the land. It helped me breathe again. I dug in the final row of native sedge near the waterline and restored a strip of river birch along the western bank. I repainted the trailhead marker my father had carved decades ago, a piece of cedar wood shaped like a canoe paddle, with the words "Dear Water begins here," etched deep in its center. It was more than sentiment. It was a boundary. Then came the water reports. On the fourth morning after the hearing, I overheard two HOA landscapers arguing at the edge of the road. "Pressure's down again," one said, holding his phone up to check a flow meter. Sprinklers on Maple Loop barely hit 10%. Bethany's gonna lose her mind. I didn't say anything. I just listened from the porch, a mug of coffee in hand. That same day, the Brookshire Waterside HOA sent out an urgent maintenance notice via email. A friend in the neighborhood forwarded it to me. It read, "Residents may experience a temporary reduction in water pressure due to a regional infrastructure recalibration. Please limit outdoor water usage and report any severe service drops to the HOA Environmental Services Committee." Regional recalibration. What a joke. The truth was, I had initiated a full maintenance assessment of the water system on my land. Legally, I was within my rights to do so. The 1982 easement agreement gave me the authority and the responsibility to conduct seasonal reviews and halt water flow temporarily for safety inspections. I hadn't done it in years, but now seemed like the perfect time. I notified the county, filed the forms, and then shut off the flow control valve at the creek's mouth. Overnight, the HOA's pristine lake levels dropped. Sprinklers sputtered. Decorative fountains stopped bubbling. By noon the next day, I heard the first desperate knocks. This time it wasn't enforcers or paralegals. It was a man in his 60s, gray hair slicked back, wearing a golf shirt and khakis. His badge read Facilities Coordinator. He introduced himself as Leonard. "I was hoping we could chat," he said, twisting his cap nervously. "Just the two of us." I stepped onto the porch. "Sure." He looked exhausted. "We understand that you own the rights to the water infrastructure, and we respect that. We really do. But this shutdown, it's hitting people hard." "People," I repeated. He nodded. "Elderly residents, families with gardens, folks who don't have any idea what's going on." "And why don't they?" I asked, voice calm. He shifted. "Bethany may have presented the situation differently." I leaned against the post. "You mean she told them she controlled everything and ignored the truth?" Leonard didn't deny it. He just sighed. "She's not speaking for all of us anymore," he said. "There was a vote, emergency session, quiet but decisive." I tilted my head, "And she was removed as chairwoman yesterday." I blinked, that I hadn't expected. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket and handed it to me. It was a signed notice from the HOA board announcing a restructuring of leadership due to procedural misconduct and failure to disclose legal risks. Leonard was the interim liaison. "I'm not here to pick a fight," he added. "I'm here to make things right." I said nothing for a moment. Then I gestured to this porch chair beside me. "Sit down." He did. We talked for nearly an hour about the land, the water, the decades of bad assumptions that had led the HOA to believe they owned more than they did. I explained the history of the creek, how my grandfather had preserved it, how my father had built a manual floodgate to prevent erosion, how none of that had ever been acknowledged by the community that drank its water. Leonard listened, and when he left, he didn't leave angry. 2 days later, a new letter arrived in the mail. It was written on HOA letterhead, but with a different tone, measured, respectful, even apologetic. They requested a formal meeting to discuss access rights maintenance responsibilities, and most surprisingly, reimbursement for historical use of the water system. They wanted to start over. I showed up to the meeting with my binder in hand, same as before. This time I was met not with stares or posturing, but with nods and a fresh pot of coffee. The new board proposed a maintenance partnership. I would retain full ownership and control, but would allow scheduled access for inspections, fire prevention efforts, and minor upgrades, provided they were pre-approved. In return, the HOA would pay a modest monthly fee into a community trust earmarked for land conservation and waterway upkeep. It wasn't about money. It was about acknowledgement. I reviewed the proposal, made a few adjustments, and signed. The flow resumed that night. The fountains bubbled. The sprinklers hissed back to life. And no one came to my porch with threats again. Instead, the next morning, I found something resting on the flat stone by the creek. A small ceramic heron, hand-painted blue and white with careful strokes along the wings. There was no note, just a quiet offering, a peace token. I left it where it stood, right where Deerwater began. Word spread fast after the water returned. You could feel it in the air. Less tension, more curiosity. People who had once only scowled in my direction now offered hesitant nods. Some even waved. The transformation wasn't just environmental, it was social. And then, on a quiet Tuesday morning, I received a formal invitation. It was hand-delivered in a crisp envelope, not stuffed in my mailbox like the HOA's past threats. It was addressed to me with care and courtesy. It read, "Dear Mr. Carter, on behalf of the Brookshire Waterside HOA Board of Directors, we respectfully invite you to attend our upcoming emergency homeowners meeting as a recognized land steward and stakeholder whose contributions have shaped our community. We hope to engage in open discussion and mutual understanding as we take steps toward transparent and lawful collaboration. Sincerely, Leonard Whitmore, Interim Chair." At first, I almost tossed it aside. Old instincts reminded me that these were the same people who tried to bully me with legal jargons, badges, and veiled threats. But something about the tone felt different. So I went. I didn't wear a suit. I wore jeans and a clean shirt. Boots as always. I brought my binder, but I didn't intend to use it. This wasn't about proving anything anymore. I had already done that. Now it was about seeing what kind of community they wanted to rebuild and whether I had a place in it. The meeting was held in the Brookshire Community Center, a stone and timber building that sat just above the lake facing the sunset. Rows of metal chairs filled the hall. Most were occupied residence board members, even a few people I hadn't seen before. At the front stood Leonard along with 3 other board members. One of them, an older woman named Gloria, was the only person from the original group who didn't scowl when I first moved in. She offered a warm smile when I entered and even patted the seat beside her. I took it. Leonard opened the meeting with a short statement about the importance of mutual respect, recalibration, and learning from missteps. The words were careful, but the tone was humble. Then he did something I didn't expect. He passed me the microphone. I looked at it like it was a snake. But then I stood. I held the mic low and let my voice carry. I came here thinking I'd live in peace, that I could keep to myself, restore the land my family left me, and maybe share a few hellos with the folks across the road. But from the day I started clearing brush, I was treated like a trespasser on my own soil. A few people shifted in their seats. No one interrupted. You sent letters. You sent enforcers. You threatened me with laws that didn't apply. And the whole time, none of you ever came over to just talk. I paused, letting the silence land. But here's the thing. This isn't just about property lines or water rights. It's about how we choose to live next to each other. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to like what I do with my land. But you do have to respect that it's mine. I looked out over the group faces I once saw as adversaries, now quiet and watching. I'm willing to work with you, maintain the waterway, coordinate inspections, even contribute to a shared conservation fund. But I won't be bullied, I won't be ignored, and I won't be silenced. I handed the mic back and sat down. There was no applause. But there was a long silence, one of consideration, not discomfort. Then Gloria stood. She told the group about the time her dog got stuck near the creek and I helped pull it out. About how her backyard used to flood before I restored the water line. About how no one else had ever bothered to check on that part of the property. Others followed. A young woman mentioned that her toddler had recently seen fish in the lake for the first time. An elderly man admitted he didn't realize the HOA didn't own the land until he read the meeting notice. It turned into something I hadn't expected, a confession of sorts. A release. People airing their grievances, not against me, but against the fear that had built up under Bethany's rule. The way decisions were made without input. The way power had become concentrated in the hands of a few who hid behind rules no one questioned. When Leonard resumed the floor, he looked tired but hopeful. I propose a new resolution, he said, reading from a paper. To formally recognize Mr. Carter as an independent stakeholder with protected rights, to grant him a voice if he chooses to participate in environmental decisions that affect shared resources, and to cease all prior actions taken against him by the HOA. The resolution passed with an overwhelming show of hands. When the meeting adjourned, I was approached by a dozen different people, some apologizing, some curious, some just wanting to shake hands. One man, probably in his 40s, leaned in and said, "Honestly, I just thought you were a cranky old vet. But after tonight, respect, man. Real respect." Real? I chuckled. I'm still cranky. He laughed. On my way out, I caught sight of the old plaque on the community center wall. It was tarnished brass etched with the words, "Built on shared trust, protected by neighbors." It felt ironic, but also possible. Maybe, just maybe, they'd remembered what that meant. And maybe, just maybe, I was finally part of something worth protecting. I thought the court battle was behind me. After the emergency HOA meeting, the tone of the community had shifted. People waved. Strangers asked about native plants. A group of kids even helped me clear out debris from the south bend of the creek one Saturday morning. It almost felt like the worst was over. But old systems don't let go that easily. 2 weeks after the meeting, I received a certified letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. Thompson, Reed & Bellamy, LLP. The envelope was heavy, multiple pages thick, and bore the same cold tone I'd grown used to. But this one wasn't from the HOA. It was from a Bethany Ward. Apparently, she'd hired private counsel. And she wasn't just upset, she was launching a personal lawsuit. Her claim that my actions caused permanent damage to the natural harmony and aesthetic value of the Brookshire neighborhood, and that I had interfered with long-standing recreational expectations shared by the community. She wanted financial compensation, tens of thousands of dollars, and she demanded a court-mandated restoration of the original creek alignment as it had existed prior to my excavation. In short, she was trying to erase everything I'd done. I stared at the letter for a long time, not out of fear, but out of sheer disbelief. Bethany hadn't just overstepped, she had detonated a legal mine under her own feet. This wasn't just misguided, it was suicidal litigation. Still, I didn't take it lightly. I called Michael Danner again, my old army buddy turned land use attorney. He read the claim and whistled through his teeth. She's either very bold or very stupid. Maybe both. We got to work. This time I didn't just prepare a defense, I prepared an offense. Michael filed a countersuit accusing Bethany of libel, harassment, malicious prosecution, and intentional misrepresentation of legal authority. He pulled every document she'd signed as chairwoman, every email she'd sent under false pretense, and even dug up a threatening voicemail she'd left a resident back in March 1 where she said, "I don't care what the deed says, that land was meant to be ours." We subpoenaed footage from her HOA safety patrol stunts, including the video where she tried to cite me for environmental disruption with no jurisdiction. And most importantly, we brought in 2 key experts, a conservation biologist from the county and a land surveyor certified by the state. Both testified that the work I'd done had improved the water quality, reduced erosion, and restored the creek to a more sustainable path. When the hearing date arrived, I wore the same boots I always did, scuffed but clean. Michael wore a gray suit and brought 3 briefcases. Bethany, on the other hand, showed up with a high-priced attorney in a navy pinstripe who looked like he'd never set foot near a creek. She wore all white like she was headed to a purity ceremony. The judge was different this time, a woman mid-50s, sharp-eyed and unimpressed by performance. Bethany's attorney went first. His arguments were emotional, full of words like disruption, emotional distress, and a community under siege. He played clips from HOA meetings, showed grainy cell phone photos of the excavation process, and even brought in a letter from a neighbor who claimed my restoration had ruined her view. Michael didn't blink. When it was our turn, he stood calmly and methodically dismantled their case. He presented the environmental reports. He walked the judge through the original deed, the easement, and the HOA's complete lack of jurisdiction. He played the voicemail. Then he dropped the bomb. He introduced an email written by Bethany 6 months prior, before any of the conflict had gone public. In it, she wrote to a real estate agent about potentially expanding HOA boundaries to increase valuation and board influence. She wanted my land. That was the whole game. Not the creek, not the aesthetics. Power, expansion, control. The courtroom was silent. When the judge leaned forward, "Ms. Ward," she said, "do you deny writing this email?" Bethany's attorney objected, overruled. Bethany floundered, stammered something about exploratory ideas. The judge raised a brow. "Is it customary to explore annexing land you do not own, while threatening the existing owner with legal action?" Bethany turned red. Her mouth opened then closed. The judge sighed and looked over the notes again. "I find this suit to be without merit," she said plainly. "Not only is the defendant's ownership of the land legally sound, but his actions have demonstrably benefited the surrounding environment. Furthermore, the plaintiff has acted in bad faith." She set the papers down. "Motion to dismiss granted. Counterclaims will proceed to arbitration." Bethany turned to stone. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. Michael leaned in and whispered, "Want to go for coffee?" "Only if we can get it near a clean stream," I said. Weeks later, Bethany withdrew her countersuit and signed a mutual non-contact order. She sold her house that fall. Rumor had it she moved to a coastal development in Florida, one with a stricter HOA and less flexible neighbors. The rest of the board sent a letter of formal apology. Gloria even brought me a pie. But what mattered most wasn't revenge. It wasn't courtroom victories or public vindication. It was the silence that followed. A good silence. The kind that meant peace. Not from retreat, but from finally being understood. After the final ruling, life slowed in the best way possible. There were no more warning letters. No more patrol SUVs loitering near the creek. No more HOA compliance officers with printed citations tucked into clipboards they had no authority to carry. It was as if a switch had flipped in the community and the current of mistrust finally reversed its flow. The only paper that came from the HOA now was the occasional newsletter. Real newsletters, the kind filled with garden tips and lost dog notices, not veiled threats in the shape of environmental guidance. My name wasn't mentioned anymore. Not as a villain. Not as a problem. And for the first time, that omission felt like respect. Control didn't look like I imagined. It wasn't about being feared. It wasn't about forcing the HOA to bend or making them grovel in court. It was subtler than that. It was in the way people now paused before speaking with certainty about what was allowed, in how they knocked before approaching the edge of the creek, in the way Leonard, now officially elected as HOA chair, sent me quarterly reports on water usage and conservation projects, not because he had to, but because he understood that comprehension collaboration was stronger than domination. I had become something between a land steward and a silent guardian. Not a title I sought, but one I had earned, and not through yelling or lawsuits, but through patience, facts, and consistency. I'd built floodgates in jungles and repaired levees during monsoons. This was just another kind of engineering. A social one. Sometimes people ask what it's like to win against an HOA. I tell them it's not a war you win. It's a structure you rebuild. Brick by brick, document by document, interaction by interaction. Because power, real power, doesn't come from authority. It comes from clarity. From being the one person in the room who knows where the line is and refuses to step behind it or erase it to fit someone else's illusion. Late one afternoon, Gloria stopped by with a mason jar full of wildflower seeds. I figured you'd plant them better than anyone else could, she said with a chuckle. We walked down to the bend in the creek, the one that had once been clogged with garbage and rebar. Now it curved gently beneath a canopy of new growth. I scattered the seeds as we talked about her grandkids, about the county's upcoming trout release, about how the air felt lighter lately. Feels like the neighborhood exhaled, she said. I nodded. Or maybe it finally listened. The next day, I got an unexpected visitor. Howard, the same neighbor who'd once been hesitant to speak on record about anything HOA-related, stood at my porch with a heavy-looking box in his arms. Thought this might belong here more than the HOA storage closet, he said, handing it to me. I opened it. Inside was a set of original development plans from the 1970s, blueprints, handwritten notes, even old photographs of the creek before the HOA ever existed. My father's name appeared in a few of the margins back when he'd been asked to consult on the soil grading before construction began. This, I whispered, thumbing through the fragile papers. This is history. Howard smiled. It's legacy, and it's yours. I built a display case in the cabin for the documents, nothing fancy. Just polished oak and museum glass. When people visited, I showed them not to boast, but to teach. Kids asked questions. Adults listened with interest. A local college professor even brought her environmental law class to visit the site that fall. It became something larger than just my land. It became a lesson in boundaries, physical, legal, and personal. That winter, the snow came early. I shoveled the walk like always, hauled firewood from the shed, and listened to the creek under its frozen crust. Even when the surface stilled, I knew the water flowed beneath, constant, unseen, unbothered. Kind of like me. One morning, I walked down to the lake just as the fog was lifting. The heron had returned again, poised like a statue near the edge, neck arched in stillness. Behind me, I heard soft footsteps crunching over the frost-hardened leaves. It was Leonard. I wanted to thank you, he said, at his breath clouding in the air, for what I asked, for teaching us where our limits are, and how respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn. We stood there together for a while, looking out at the water, letting silence fill the spaces that words couldn't reach. Control, respect, silence. Three things that had once seemed like separate battles now existed together, balanced like stones in a cairn. pointing the way forward. I didn't need recognition. I didn't need headlines. I just needed this. A creek that flowed the way it should. A town that remembered how to listen. And peace earned the hard way, but earned just the same. Spring came early that year. The frost melted by the second week of March, and the wildflowers bloomed before the HOA even sent out its usual newsletter about seasonal ground maintenance. The land seemed eager to breathe again, to stretch its roots into softening earth and shake off the weight of winter. And in some quiet, private way, so was I. The creek, once silenced by debris and arrogance, sang again. Every morning I walked the same path from the cabin to the water's edge, thermos in hand, boots caked with old mud. And every morning I listened. Not for threats, not for complaints or approaching SUVs, just for the creek, the way it gurgled over polished stones, the rustle of reeds against its banks, the distant echo of frogs and finches waking the valley with their own rhythm. The fight was over, but something deeper had stayed with me. It wasn't just the documents, the court rulings, or the handshakes from neighbors who had once avoided eye contact. It was the realization that the land wasn't just mine by deed. It was mine by stewardship. It lived because I listened. It healed because I stood between it and those who only wanted to control it. And the more I gave to it, the more it gave back. In May, I received a letter not from the HOA, but from the county office. It was an official invitation to consult on a new regional watershed project aimed at restoring degraded creek systems in older neighborhoods. They'd reviewed my case, seen the results, and asked if I'd be willing to share insight, not as a contractor, but as a citizen expert. I laughed out loud in the kitchen when I read it. Me, the guy they tried to evict with clipboards and citations, now being asked to teach the very systems they didn't understand. I accepted. Once a month, I drove into the county building, sat with engineers and planners, and shared everything I'd learned, not just the legal frameworks or the conservation strategies, but the human elements. How communities lose sight of the land they live on, how fear of change leads to abuse of power, and how silence, when used wisely, is the strongest kind of rebuttal. Back at home, I kept working. Not with machines anymore, just with my hands. I planted a community garden near the lake, just outside the official HOA boundary. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't need to. But I welcomed anyone who wanted to join. And they did. Slowly at first, an elderly couple who used to keep to themselves, a teenager, with a troubled past, a single mom, who just wanted her daughter to see where tomatoes come from. We grew squash, herbs, wild garlic. The soil responded to gentleness like a song. One Saturday morning, as we were harvesting the first heads of butter lettuce, a boy no older than 6 tugged at my sleeve. "Is this your land?" he asked, eyes wide. I smiled. "Some of it." "Do you own the lake too?" "I take care of it," I said. "Cool," he whispered like I was some kind of superhero. Later that week, he brought me a picture he'd drawn me standing beside the creek arms wide, with little blue lines stretching from the rocks to the lake. At the bottom, he'd written, "Mr. Carter, the water boss." I framed it, because titles mean less than actions. But sometimes, a child's drawing tells the truth more clearly than any court document ever could. By late summer, the HOA newsletter ran a feature titled, "Neighbors Who Make a Difference." And on the second page, there I was. Not because I'd asked to be, but because the story had finally changed. It wasn't about conflict anymore. It was about restoration, of land, of trust, of identity. Bethany never returned. Her house was bought by a young couple who asked if they could continue the turtle nesting zone I'd created. I told them it was already theirs, just as the creek had always belonged to those who listened to it. I still get calls from people, friends, strangers, other landowners, asking how I won against an HOA. And I always say the same thing. I didn't fight to win. I fought to remind them what they'd forgotten. That land isn't just a line on a map, it's a living memory. It's the sound of water finding its own way. It's the stillness of a morning before the noise begins. It's the choice to protect something even when no one else sees the danger. And as long as that creek runs, so does the story. Not just mine, ours. Because every time someone stands up, not with rage, but with calm certainty, every time someone says, "No, that's not right," and doesn't flinch, every time someone chooses restoration over retaliation, the water flows freer. And the silence when it comes is the kind that nourishes, that heals, that remembers, and that never ever forgets where it came from.